The pilots of a Korean Air Boeing 747 are desperately searching for the runway on their final approach to Guam in the West Pacific. Heavy rain pelts their windscreens, and dark clouds obscure the path in front of them. The runway should be straight ahead, but they can't see it. What they don't know is that they have made a grave mistake, which will soon become impossible to ignore. In the darkness, between them and the airport, lies a hill. What got the crew into this situation in the first place, and would they figure out what was happening before it was too late? 254 lives hang in the balance. This is the story of Korean Air Flight 801. It was just before 8 p.m. on an August evening in 1997 when 237 passengers boarded a Korean Air Boeing 747 at Seoul's Gimpo Airport in South Korea. Their destination was the island of Guam, a US territory in the Mariana Islands, 3.5 hours flying time to the south. For some passengers, this late-night flight would be the last leg back home. For others, it meant a return to work after a break in Korea. Taking care of them in the cabin were 14 flight attendants. The aircraft they were flying on was a 12-year-old Boeing 747-300. The 300 variant was part of an older generation of 747s, which Korean was in the process of replacing with the newer, more sophisticated 400 series. Over its 15 years of service with airlines, the 747-300 had proven itself to be a safe and reliable aircraft. And occupying the 3 seats up at the front of the jet was a safe and reliable crew. The captain, first officer, and flight engineer had arrived at the airport 2 hours before their scheduled departure, giving themselves time to collect the paperwork for the trip, brief themselves for the flight, and receive a briefing from their supervisor of flying. This supervisor of flying role was created by Korean Airlines to address deficiencies at the airline, deficiencies which had led to a spate of accidents in the previous years. The purpose of this briefing was to ensure that the pilots had reviewed all pertinent materials for the flight. On this day, the supervisor of flying was a retired 747 captain. He asked the flight crew about what he considered to be the main factor for the flight: the weather. It was well into Guam's rainy season, and the pilots discussed a typhoon near their route, as well as the inclement weather they expected to encounter on arrival at Guam. The briefing took about 10 minutes, and although it covered many of the main points of interest for the flight, some crucial things were left out. We'll see what they were in a moment. At about 8:30 that evening, the crew of 3 boarded the jumbo jet and began setting it up for departure. Sitting in the left-hand seat was the flight's captain, 42-year-old Park Yong-chul. Park had been with Korean Air for just under 10 years, the last 2 years as a captain. Before starting with the airline, he had served in the Korean Air Force, building up almost 3,000 hours of flying experience there. Since transitioning to the civilian world, he'd accumulated a further 6,000 hours of flying time, mainly on the Boeing 727 and 747. By most metrics, he was an excellent pilot, consistently receiving the highest grades in his simulator evaluations and online checks in the aircraft itself. 3 months previously, Park had received a Flight Safety Award from the airline's president for successfully landing a 747 after it suffered an engine failure at low altitude. Sitting to his right was 40-year-old First Officer Song Kyung-ho. Song had been with Korean Air for 3 years, having spent the majority of his career in the Korean Air Force. In this time, he had amassed 4,000 total flying hours, 1,500 of which on the 747. His evaluations had described him variously as above standard and standard, with a note that his altitude management was somewhat less than desirable and that he was, quote, somewhat slow to carry out directions. Importantly for this flight, as it would turn out, he was the only member of the crew not to have attended a crew resource management course. Sitting behind the pilots, in his sideways seat, was the flight engineer, 57-year-old Nam Suk-hoon. Nam had been with the airline for 18 years, logging 13,000 hours, 11,000 of which as a flight engineer. His evaluators put him at above standard and excellent. Given the wealth of experience in the cockpit, the passengers had every reason to believe that they were in safe hands. At just before 9:30 that night, slightly behind schedule, everything was finally ready to go. The passengers had boarded, the cargo had been loaded, and the plane had been filled with 51 metric tons of jet fuel. Once the pilots had received clearance from air traffic control, the massive jet was pushed back from the gate. The pilots started the plane's 4 engines in sequence and began their taxi out to the runway. The captain would be flying the aircraft to Guam this night, while the first officer handled the radios and monitored the aircraft. At 10 minutes past 10, Flight 801 lined up on the runway and began its takeoff roll. The 747 was airborne and climbing out into the inky black sky. The pilots had a long night ahead of them. After landing in Guam, they would take on a new load of passengers and fuel and then fly back to Seoul, arriving at 8:30 in the morning. Their total duty time was expected to be 12.5 hours. Captain Park turned the plane south towards Guam and climbed the aircraft to its initial cruising altitude. This flight would take place entirely in darkness, with the pilots not expecting to see the sun until the return journey to Seoul. As the aircraft climbed, everything was normal. The pilots were making use of their weather radar to pick out storm clouds en route, but at least initially, they seemed to be being spared the worst of the weather, and the flight progressed smoothly. Luckily for them, the 747 was a sturdy vessel. The cabin crew passed through the aisles with food and drinks. The relatively short length of the flight, just 3 hours, meant that there wasn't really time for any of the passengers to get much sleep before arrival. What the passengers didn't know was that they wouldn't be the only ones arriving at Guam a little tired. Captain Park had originally been scheduled to fly to Dubai on this night. However, he had not gotten enough rest after his previous flight in from Hong Kong, so he was put on the shorter Guam flight instead. Having a tired pilot at the helm is bad enough in the best of times, but as we'll now see, this approach into Guam would not be taking place in the best of times. As Flight 801 zoomed southeast over the Philippine Sea, the island of Guam was being pelted by rain showers. Thankfully for arriving aircraft, the airport was equipped with an instrument landing system, which would allow the crew to make an approach even without being able to see the runway. The instrument landing system, or ILS, consists of 2 radio beams, a localizer which provides pilots with lateral guidance towards the runway, and a glide slope which gives vertical guidance. By simply following the indications on their instruments, pilots can fly all the way down to the runway without ever seeing it out their windscreens. But on this night, there was a problem. The glide slope, the radio beam that tells pilots whether they are high or low on the approach, wasn't working. A NOTAM had been published about this, but it was one of the items which had not been covered by the supervisor of flying back at Seoul. Nonetheless, the pilots were aware of it, and we'll see how they dealt with it in a moment. At this point in the flight, the pilots had climbed to their final cruising altitude of 41,000 feet. They began encountering some turbulence as they neared the outer edges of the typhoon along their route, but it was nothing too severe. In less than half an hour, they would begin their descent. After 3 hours in the air, Flight 801 was now just 240 miles from Guam. They were now within radio range of Guam radar control, and the first officer made contact. The controller told him that he could expect to land on runway 6 left. Now it was time for the captain, as pilot flying, to brief the approach. He took out his approach chart and began talking the other pilots through it. But here is where we encounter another problem, and it's a problem which should have been noticed and fixed hours earlier in the briefing room at Seoul. Here is a photocopy of the captain's approach chart. It's dated August 2nd, 1996, which was the most current approach chart for Guam at the time. The first officer should have been following this brief on his own chart, as both pilots would need their charts in front of them during the approach. The captain would be using his to fly, and the first officer would be using his to make sure that the captain was flying the approach correctly. But on this night, the first officer had a different chart. This is a copy of his approach chart. It was dated January 19th, 1996, meaning that it was now very much out of date, as significant changes to the procedure had been introduced in the meantime. Whether or not the pilots noticed this is unclear, but the captain began briefing using his chart nonetheless. Because the glide slope was not working, the approach chart outlined another method to guide the pilot's descent as they neared the airport. Simply put, it told them which altitudes they would need to be at particular distances from the runway. The approach chart instructed the pilots to cross the waypoint Flake, located 7 miles from the Nimitz radio beacon, at or above 2,600 feet. From there, the pilots would descend to 2,000 feet until they reached the outer marker, a radio beacon which was 1.6 miles from the Nimitz beacon. From there, they were to descend to 1,440 feet until they reached Nimitz. At Nimitz, they would continue descending to 560 feet, where they must stay until catching sight of the runway. if they didn't see the runway by the time they were 2.8 miles past Nimitz, they would have to carry out a missed approach. If it sounds like I said the word Nimitz a lot there, that's because that radio beacon is a key component of this approach. And its location, 3.3 miles from the runway, made Guam something of an unusual airport to fly into. Normally, distances on approach charts are referenced to the runway threshold, not a beacon some distance from it. The pilots of Flight 801 would have to keep this in mind as they made their approach. When the instruments showed a distance of, say, 7 miles, this meant that they were 7 miles from the Nimitz radio beacon and 10 miles from the airport. It also meant that after they passed the beacon during the approach and began flying away from it, the distance on their instruments would start counting up rather than down. There was nothing overly complex about this. The pilots would just have to keep it in mind as they flew the approach. By the time Captain Park had finished the approach briefing, Flight 801 was just over 150 nautical miles from the airport. It was now time to start descending. The controller had cleared them directly down to 2,600 feet. The captain dialed this altitude into the autopilot window and put the plane in a descent. He tuned his navigation radio to 110.3 MHz so that he could receive the localizer beam once he neared the airport. Meanwhile, the first officer had his equipment set to 115.3 to receive the Nimitz radio beacon, which he would use to provide the captain with distance information for the approach. The captain had flown into Guam a month previously in similar conditions. On that occasion, he'd been able to see the runway from quite far out, in between rain showers. He was expecting the situation to be similar this time, so although he had briefed an instrument approach, the crew were expecting to be able to see the runway from a few miles out. In the back of the aircraft, the cabin crew were cleaning up after the meal service, putting away the trolleys, and securing the cabin for landing. They were now less than 30 minutes from touchdown. As they descended, Captain Park lamented the airline's scheduling, saying, "They make us work to maximum, up to maximum. Probably this way hotel expenses will be saved for cabin crews and maximise the flight hours. Anyway, they make us classic guys work to maximum." Park normally went to bed at around 10 p.m, so it was now more than 3 hours past his usual bedtime. Not long after, he commented, really sleepy." Normally, people underestimate the degree to which they are fatigued. The fact that Park was clearly aware of how tired he was shows that his performance was now likely becoming significantly degraded. But there was no time for rest. He first had to land in Guam and then get the aircraft turned around for the return flight to Seoul. Almost as if to wake him up, or take him deeper into what would soon be a nightmare, the first officer delivered some bad news. The weather at Guam was getting worse, and directly ahead of them were storm clouds from the nearby typhoon. While there was nothing but blackness out their windscreens, they could clearly see the clouds on their weather radar. The captain told the first officer to ask air traffic control if they could deviate 20 miles to the left to avoid them. But the first officer thought it looked clearer elsewhere, and he asked the captain if he didn't think this was the better direction to take. Park dismissed the question and repeated, "Left, request deviation 10 mile. The controller granted Park's request to deviate 10 miles left of track due to weather. The aircraft gently began banking to the left, away from the storm clouds. Meanwhile, the pilots completed the descent checklist, ensuring that the cabin pressurization was set for landing, that they had correctly set the approach speeds on their instruments, that the weather radar was correctly set, and, among a few other things, that the passenger seatbelt sign was turned on. They were now just 20 minutes from landing. Having diverted around the weather, the flight crew then caught sight of the island of Guam. "It's Guam, Guam," said the flight engineer. First Officer Song told the controller that they were now clear of the weather, and he asked for radar vectors to runway 6 left. The controller instructed the flight to turn right heading 120 degrees. The pilots then set their instruments up for the landing, and carried out the approach checklist, turning on the landing lights and putting on their shoulder harnesses. Not long after this, they entered the clouds, and lost sight of the island. They wouldn't be seeing much of it for the remainder of the flight. As they descended through 2,800 feet, the controller cleared Flight 801 to turn east, so that they could intercept the localizer beam to the runway. The pilots started to configure the 747 for landing, extending the flaps to 10 degrees. Things were now about to start happening very quickly. As Flight 801 lined up with the runway, the controller reminded the crew that the glide slope was unusable. The pilots could see on their instruments that they were correctly aligned with runway 06 left. They were now just 10 miles from the airport, and level at 2,600 feet, just where they were supposed to be. But then, something unexpected happened. On his instruments, the captain could see the glide slope needle moving. "Is that the glide slope working? Glide slope, yeah?" asked Nam, the flight engineer. Yes, it's working," replied Captain Park. "Why is it working?" somebody asked. But just because the glide slope was showing up on their instruments didn't mean it was working. What the pilots were receiving here were false indications from an unknown source. First Officer Song reminded the others, not usable. As tempting as it was to believe these signals, the pilots would have to ignore them. They continued towards the airport, lowering the gear. As they had now reached the flake waypoint, 7 miles from the Nimitz beacon, it was safe to descend to 2,000 feet. The pilots dialed this altitude into the autopilot and set a descent rate of 1,000 feet per minute. Following these altitude restrictions carefully is vitally important. They exist to ensure one thing: terrain separation. In other words, descend below one of these altitudes and there's a good chance you'll crash into a mountain. In the case of Guam, the Nimitz radio beacon itself is located on a hill, Nimitz Hill, which reaches up to 800 feet high, directly on the approach path to runway 6 left. Things happen fast in a jet, and these kinds of approaches create a high workload for the pilots. To reduce their workload, instead of descending and then leveling off and then descending again, pilots tend to opt for a continuous descent, at a rate that allows them to satisfy each of the altitude constraints on the way down. However, back when Captain Park had briefed the approach during the cruise, he didn't mention whether he would be doing a continuous approach or what's known as a dive and drive approach, where the step-down altitudes are followed in sequence. Even more crucially, he didn't highlight to the crew that the Nimitz radio beacon, which the whole approach was designed around, was located not at the runway threshold, but 3 miles from the runway. Keeping this at the top of everybody's minds would have been useful, given how infrequently this crew flew into Guam. As they descended through 2,400 feet, the first officer called out, approaching 1,400. The captain reminded himself and the other crew that because the glide slope was not working, they would need to maintain 1,440 feet as per their charts. He asked the first officer to set this altitude on the autopilot. But here was where the captain and first officer would make a mistake, which would set off a chain of events endangering the lives of everyone on board. The approach chart instructed them not to descend below 2,000 feet until they were 1.6 miles from the Nimitz beacon. At this point, they were still about 5 miles from the beacon, or around 8 miles from the runway. Why had the captain begun his descent so early? Before anybody had time to take stock of the mistake that had just been made, the controller handed Flight 801 off to Guam Tower. First Officer Song contacted the tower controller, who then cleared them to land. Captain Park called for the flaps to be set to 30 degrees, and he told the crew to keep an eye out for the runway. Based on his previous approach into Guam a month ago, he expected to catch sight of the runway at any moment. This is why his approach briefing earlier had been so short. In fact, even the training video, which Korean Air showed the pilots before they flew here last time, told them to expect to carry out the approach visually. But Flight 801 was in thick cloud, and it was now heading into heavy rain. The plane was now descending through 1,600 feet, still over 2 miles from the Nimitz beacon. It should have been level at 2,000 feet, waiting until it was 1.6 miles from Nimitz to descend any further. But now, Captain Park would make a second mistake. Before the crew even reached the 1,440 foot level off point, which was already too low for their current position, he told the first officer to set the next lowest point on the autopilot, which was the final altitude for the approach, the so-called minimum descent altitude, or MDA. This was at just 560 feet. The first officer dutifully dialed this into the autopilot, and Flight 801 continued its descent. Through a combination of fatigue, an incomplete briefing, and the expectation of a visual approach, the captain had now clearly lost situational awareness. His mental picture of where the plane was did not match reality at all. But what could explain his premature descent? Why was he already descending to the minimum descent altitude while he was still so far from the runway? In all likelihood, Captain Park had now forgotten that the instrument in front of him was showing his distance not to the runway threshold, but to the Nimitz beacon. When it showed a distance of 5 miles, he figured that he was 5 miles from the airport, when in reality he was 5 miles from the beacon, and therefore 8 miles from the airport. In other words, he was 3 miles further from the airport than he thought he was. If he had briefed the approach fully, he would have mentioned that the flight could not descend below 1,440 feet until they passed Nimitz. They would know they had passed Nimitz when the distance to it on this instrument read 0 and the flag switched from to from. From there, and only there, could they safely begin to descend below 1,440 feet. This was clearly outlined on the charts, yet here they were, still 2 miles from Nimitz, descending through 1,300 feet, and setting 500 feet on their autopilot. Whether the first officer had the same mental picture as the captain is not clear. It's entirely possible that he knew that the captain was not following the procedure correctly, but that he trusted that the captain knew what he was doing. It's also possible that he simply wasn't able to follow what the captain was doing because he didn't have the most up-to-date charts in front of him. But there was somebody else who should have been aware that all was not well with Flight 801. The controller. Guam's airport was equipped with what's known as a minimum safe altitude warning system. This system issues visual and aural alerts to controllers whenever an aircraft descends below a predetermined safe altitude. Flight 801 was now below this altitude, and it should have triggered the alarm. However, when this system was first installed 7 years previously, it generated a lot of false warnings. So, 2 years previously, with the approval of the US Federal Aviation Administration, the airport had essentially disabled the system. The pilots were on their own.
1,000.
The aircraft's computer told the crew that they were now 1,000 feet above the ground. Yet again, the glide slope needle appeared to be giving plausible readings. Despite agreeing to ignore it earlier, the captain now became confused about whether the glide slope was in fact working. He pointed it out to his colleagues, but they ignored it. The aircraft then entered a heavy rain shower, and the flight engineer turned on the windscreen wipers. Every second counted. The pilots were peering ahead through the darkness, desperate to locate the runway lights. If they could see them, they could proceed with the landing. "Not in sight?" asked Song. This wasn't what the pilots had planned. They were sure that they would be seeing the runway by this point. Then, the plane's automated voice called out
500.
meaning that they were now just 500 feet above the ground. "Eh?" the flight engineer said, astonished. But the two other pilots said nothing, and pressed on with the approach. These alerts were coming from sensors on the underside of the aircraft, which provide indications to this instrument here, the radio altimeter. It measures the plane's actual height while it is low to the ground, while the pilot's main altimeters, here and here, tell them their altitude above sea level. The fact that the radio altimeter showed them to be 500 feet above the ground, while their main altimeters showed them to be at 1,200 feet above sea level, meant that they must now be over high ground. This should have been a clue to the pilots that they were flying too low. Had Captain Park looked at his radio altimeter, he would have seen it ticking down to 0 fast, indicating that they were dangerously close to high terrain, which was now sloping up to meet them. Oblivious to the mortal danger they were now in, the pilots continued their pre-landing checklists. They calmly confirmed that the auto brakes were set, that the landing gear was down and locked, that the spoilers were armed, and that the flaps were set for landing. As they worked through the checklist, the computer called out,
Minimum.
This should have been a big clue to the pilots that something was wrong. They should have received this call out just seconds from landing, when they had descended below their minimum descent altitude of 560 feet. Yet somehow they were receiving it while descending through 700 feet. This could only mean one thing. There was high ground beneath them. Still convinced that the runway was less than a mile away, the captain pressed on, continuing his descent below the minimums. But now, the pilots would receive a warning they couldn't ignore.
Sink rate.
Sink rate, okay, said the first officer. The sink rate was definitely not okay. 200, flight engineer Nam called, referencing the radio altimeter, which showed that they were now just 200 feet above the ground. The first officer suggested that they make a missed approach. It didn't make sense that they were 200 feet above the ground and still didn't have the runway in sight. But the captain didn't respond. "Not in sight," affirmed Nam, backing up his colleague. 1 second later, Song firmly repeated to the captain, "Not in sight, missed approach." At this point, it was the first officer's responsibility to take control and carry out the missed approach himself. If he did, he would save the jet and its over 200 passengers. But hundreds of years of Korean deference to rank, bottled up and concentrated by years of military and aviation training, was now working against him. He simply couldn't bring himself to do what needed to be done. "Go round," Nam called. After 2 pleas each from the first officer and flight engineer, Captain Park finally agreed. He pushed the throttle levers forward and disconnected the autopilot to climb away from the ground. But still not understanding the seriousness of the situation, his efforts on the controls were weak and tentative. He was pulling back in his control column so slightly that the nose was only rising by 1 degree per second. The plane was now barely even 100 feet above the terrain, and it still wasn't climbing. In quick succession, the ground proximity warning system called out
50, 40, 30, 20.
Just 3 seconds after Captain Park had decided to go around, Flight 801 impacted Nimitz Hill. The aircraft broke apart and burst into flames. It was 9 minutes before the controllers at Guam even realized that the plane had crashed. When rescuers finally reached the scene almost an hour after the crash, only 31 of the 254 passengers and crew on board had survived, 6 of whom would later die of their injuries. The crash of Flight 801 came as a shock to the industry. It was South Korea's worst accident since one of its 747s was shot down by the Soviet Union in 1983. You can watch the video I made about that horrific incident by tapping the link now appearing at the top right of your screen. 3 years after the crash of Flight 801 in the year 2000, the US National Transportation Safety Board released their final report on the accident. In it, they recommended that flight crews carry out a full briefing before conducting instrument approaches. If Captain Park had done this, he may have been more aware of the high terrain around Nimitz and the fact that the distances displayed on his instruments were to the beacon and not the runway. The report also recommended that crews be trained to ignore any readings on their instruments when the respective navigation aid is known to be inoperative. In this case, the crew's confusion about the glide slope cost them precious moments of attention, which they should have been devoting to carrying out their approach as planned. 17 days after the accident, after years of being disabled, the minimum safe altitude warning system at Guam was finally reinstated, although some false warnings persisted. Perhaps the most valuable lesson of all to come from this crash, though, and the one that affects not just Guam or Korean Air, but everyone who flies today, is the importance of a key component of crew resource management known as threat and error management. This concept was developed by psychologists at the University of Texas in 1994, and if it had been used by the crew of Flight 801, they would have spoken explicitly in their briefing about the threats they faced on this flight, including flying at night, flying into clouds, an unserviceable glide slope, the fact that the Nimitz beacon was not located at the airport, and the high terrain on the approach path. The crew would also have spelled out to each other how they were going to mitigate these threats. This aspect of CRM has become a global standard since the crash of Flight 801, and its widespread adoption has made the kind of mistakes made on this night far less common.